This interview was recorded at the 2012 SVS annual meeting in Washington, D.C.
Hi, my name is Melina Kibbe, and welcome to the next installment of one of the SVS History Work Group videos. This project was commissioned by the Society for Vascular Surgery to basically interview pioneers in vascular surgery. And today I have the distinct pleasure to interview Dr. Herb Dardik. Dr. Dardik, welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you. So let's start off by, why don't you tell me, when were you born?
A long time ago. Born on May 17th, 1935, and though I didn't clock it, my mother told me 3:45 in the afternoon on a Friday.
Oh my goodness, oh my goodness. And where were you born at?
Long Branch, New Jersey. And most people don't know this, but Long Branch was the nation's first seashore resort.
Oh.
And the presidents would come, and one of them, President Garfield, actually was brought there when he was assassinated and ultimately died. And it was the home of Woodrow Wilson.
I did not know
It used
that.
to be, and it's coming back as a very significant Jersey Shore town.
Tell me about your parents.
My parents were immigrants from Russia and arrived here in 1924. They actually met and married in Russia, and my mother was only 15 and my father was 20. Both sets of parents didn't like each of the other. Oh. And it was, from what I was told, was not an easy marriage. But then my father was conscripted into the Red Army and actually escaped from them. And if he had been caught, he would have been shot. And he traveled under passport Karl Karlovich. Did all kinds of crazy things, jumping off trains with his cousin. And then went chasing after my mother, and they ended up in Hamburg, and I have a picture of that actually. It was published in the Jewish Forwards, a newspaper that came out, and I have a copy of it. And then from there they went to Liverpool, and from Liverpool they somehow my mother came separate from there, and you had to have someone who was your proctor or who took care of you. And she was taken care of by her brother and sisters. My father had no one. He thought he had his uncle come, but it turned out no one showed. And so he was not allowed to come in, and the ship went from New York back up to Boston, supposedly to get him back to Russia. Captain on the ship apparently was a very kind-hearted person and told him, listen, my back is turned and I don't care what you do. Jumped ship and found my mother, and then in the United States, the first night they spent together was in Spotswood, New Jersey, and they were pretty convinced that the Revolutionary War was starting again, and they hid under the bed all night, and the next day they learned all about July 4th. So they had heard all those fireworks. They didn't know what was going on.
Oh, goodness.
They had to get remarried because there was no certification that they came with. Then from there, they moved to Long Branch. And over a period of 10 years, 6 of us were born.
Oh, goodness.
I was number 5. First, there were 3 girls. And my father really wanted boys, and I guess they persisted, and the next 3 were boys.
Wow.
So we were 3 and 3, and we grew up on the Jersey Shore, and I particularly thought I owned the whole Jersey Shore area. I still feel that way at times.
Since your parents came from Russia, is Dardik the original name?
Yes, but Dardik is actually an Aramaic derivative, and Aramaic is the language that was spoken at the time of Jesus.
Yes.
Because it was the alternative to Hebrew, which was a holy language and couldn't be spoken in daily discourse. So Aramaic was the word, and it means a teacher of small children, which is what my father ultimately became, and married a teacher. People ask me what I do. I tell them I'm a teacher who happens to operate. So it kind of fits in with the name.
That is interesting. I didn't know that about your name.
Right.
So tell me about your siblings then. You have 5 other siblings.
5 others, but let me just tell you in between a little bit. During that time, my father developed severe Marie Strompel spondylosis and did a very foolish thing. Ended up going up to the old Joint Hospital in New York. And at that time, they were doing a procedure where they disarticulated the femur from the acetabulum. They covered it with fasciolata, put it back in, and put him in a body spica cast for 6 months.
Oh, goodness.
At the end of that, he was fused, totally crippled, and that accounts for the 4-year difference, part of it, between the 3 and my older brother, and then there's a bunch of years, and me and my younger brother. But he actually was basically crippled and functioned primarily as a teacher, a private teacher for young kids to learn their bar mitzvah lessons, things like that. And he was also believe it or not, in the kosher world, you have to have the slaughter of the chickens and the turkeys, and has to be done by a person who's really knowledgeable and skilled and can tell if there's something wrong with the animal. And that's what he did. He was actually the 10th generation of doing that. And I used to hold the chickens for him sometimes. And I thought I was a big scientist when I was in high school. I would collect blood. My older brother brought me some calcium oxalate, and I'd keep those tubes with my socks. Of course, very upset when my mother threw them out. But
wow.
that was my father. He was at home. He did the cooking. My mother actually worked in a factory.
If he was a 10th generation doing that, did he pass it on to you? Are you the 11th generation?
He passed it on to my older brother.
Ah.
I was not that interested.
Okay.
But my older brother did, and then actually there's more beyond that. My younger brother's son is a rabbi, and he kept it up.
Oh.
So it's kind of still moving along. I did it in a different form, I guess. I went
There
into
you
the
go.
human side.
So
But,
your mother, you were going to say she's a seamstress.
she worked in a factory, and she was actually the money earner more than anyone. And I remember during World War II, bringing her sometimes lunch. And we used to get these coupons for doing the rationing. You can only buy a 5-pound thing of sugar. And I learned how to buy watermelons, and I would stop. I was 7, 8 years old, but we did it. And with my wagon over to the A&P and did all that stuff. Very independent in a way. But we were raised in a very orthodox religious home. But the first to break away actually was number 6, my brother, because he was actually a phenomenal track person. And he had on Saturday, the Sabbath, he had to go run and do, and so my father basically kind of eased up at that point. And he actually became the captain of the University of Pennsylvania track team.
And this is Irving.
This is Irving.
Irving Dardik.
And Irving Dardik ultimately became my junior partner, and we can probably get to that later. But currently, he is very interested in doing work with a scientific approach to what is the best way to keep fit and to exercise.
And didn't I hear that he was also a contender for the Olympics at one point?
He was. He was the captain of the University of Pennsylvania track team, and actually held some records in the Maccabeans in Israel. I went with him a few times as a team doctor. It was fun. And he was running in the Olympic trials one day, and I was there, and he got boxed in, fell over, and fractured his leg.
Oh.
I kid with him. I thought I should have shot him at that point, but clearly at the point he no longer could run the way he did.
Yeah.
And so he got interested and followed me in medicine, and ultimately became the physician at the Pan American Games in 1970s.
Wow.
And that kept him away from the practice for a long time, and then he got involved with the Olympics. And he's the one that actually started the U.S. Olympic Sports Medical Council.
Oh, wow.
And he's the one that started all that doping business.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah. But he's had a lifelong interest, obviously, and he backed out of the surgery world, which was, he was an excellent technical surgeon, less interested in academia than I was. But now he's totally consumed with the how does a person keep fit optimally? Yeah. I mean, we heard today even supervised exercise, but the exercise ranges from A to Z, and for how long, what kind, when do you stop, what's recovery, and that's his interest. I'm actually starting to develop my interest in that, and I might be helping him with this.
Interesting. Now tell me about some of your early education, high school, college.
Well, let me go back a little bit before. At home, we spoke, my first language was Yiddish, which is a combination of German and Hebrew and Eastern language. And that was my first language, and everyone asked me, where did you learn to speak English? I tell them, actually in the gutter. I have no idea, because we never spoke it at home. Oh, wow. And I was fluent in reading, I still am, and writing it, and it's not Hebrew. Hebrew I learned also from my father, in terms of the biblical texts and the like.
And Russian as well? Do you speak Russian?
No, I only knew some inappropriate words in Russian. When my father got angry, I knew that there was something inappropriate. I guess with my sibs, it was all English at that point as we grew up. And my older sister actually had scarlet fever at that point, which we don't see these days. Yeah. And I remember her being isolated in her own room. She couldn't go to school. And she was the only one who never got to college, and she became a real expert in jewelry and selling and that. She was a wonderful person. She passed on she had a mucus adenoCA. My middle sister was an artist. She was excellent. She actually obtained a PhD in art history in Pittsburgh, and has multiple commissions in Pittsburgh and other sites. And I have some of her sculpture, I have some of her paintings, really excellent. She passed on recently from Alzheimer's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The next one down, Ray, became a kindergarten teacher. She's alive, doing well. Always fractures a leg once every 2 years, but she's unbelievable dynamo. And she's a great grandmother already, several times over. Then there's the gap. Then there's my older brother, who became an oral surgeon. So he was the first one that went into the medical world. And ironically, at the end of his life, he developed myelofibrosis and carcinoma of the tongue. Oh. And that's what did him in. And then there's me and my brother Irving. So 3 of the 6 are still going. I have plans to keep going for a long, long, long time.
Very good.
I have another medical history, which I think I may have been alluded to, but I can cover some of that also.
So now tell me about high school. Where'd you go to high school?
Went to high school. All my schooling was in Long Branch, public school. I would get up in the morning. My father would study with me something from the Bible. I'd go off to public school. In those days, it was like 9 to 3. And 3 o'clock, I'd join up with my father and all the kids in his class. 5 o'clock, done with that. All the kids went home. I was stuck with my father. We had dinner, did my homework, studied some more. I thought all kids did this. I thought all kids study all day and night. But, in retrospect, I think back, and I'm grateful for that, because I know where I was put. But on the other hand, he made certain, more my father than my mother, that I was on that little local, on the block baseball team. Yeah. I was the cleanup hitter, and we would meet at this lot and play baseball and practice out during the week. So it was very interesting, and an absolute requirement that we all learned how to swim, and my mother took us down the shore and just dumped us in the pool. See, nowadays you go for swimming lessons, but no way. I had to learn, I did it myself. And that was the exposure. But I graduated 1952 from Long Branch Senior High School, a total of 105 in the class. There was college course, commercial, general. I had a good friend, Jack Rosenfeld, who my father and my parents basically were very careful who we played with. And Jack was okay. And I knew him, I think, when I was 3 or 4 years old. We were still friends. And during school, he was the bright one. And as we got into senior high school, our relationship was a little strained because he became the valedictorian, beat us out. So, but truthfully, he was brilliant. He ended up at MIT and became a major scientist there. And we are still best of friends now. Better since we graduated high school. But in my junior year of high school, we were all made to take piano lessons. And I really didn't care for it initially, but there were 2 movies that came out, which I distinctly remember. One was A Song to Remember, which featured Chopin. Yep. And shortly thereafter was Gershwin in Rhapsody in Blue. And I walked out of those 2 movies, it was just like a short period of time between them. I want to be a pianist. And I started practicing, and there was a local major pianist that came out of Long Branch, and his grandma was the teacher. I played for her, and she was very encouraging. My own piano teacher, and in my senior year, I sent out applications to Juilliard, Oberlin, Eastman School of Music, a few others. Very determined, and I was doing my lesson with Mrs. Resnikoff one day, and she said to me, "Herbert, Irving has talent. You're a hard worker." I must tell you, I thought everything came crushing down on me.
Oh, yeah.
That was the end. And I withdrew my applications, and I knew I was going off to college. I had to go. But I told my parents, the only thing I know for sure, I do not, will not be a doctor. I just didn't want to do that.
Why?
If you took your hand and showed me your eye like that, I would go, ooh, or something like that. And silly things like that, you know.
So going into college, what did you think you might want to do? Because it's now clearly not music.
No, but I did like biology. And so I majored in biology, and I didn't know where I was going to go with it. I had no idea. But I ended up at a school which is no longer around. It was the Uptown campus in those days of New York University. It was the University Heights in the Bronx, and it was a very small school, a few hundred people. And when I went for my interviews, I saw a few beautiful young women. I thought, oh, this is nice. And I applied, and I needed a scholarship to go, which I got. And I ended up, and I realized those 3 women were the only secretaries there, and the rest of it was all male, which was the best thing that happened, because I buckled down, I did my work. I found myself in competition. That's what got me to medical school, with young fellows from Stuyvesant and Horace Mann and Bronx Science. They already had their quantitative analysis, and they had all these things, and I was standing there from Long Branch High School. I didn't know any of that stuff, and I asked so-and-so, can you help me? No. Can you help me on it? No. So I said, darn it, I'm gonna do this myself. I didn't think of medical school, but I buckled down, and I won every prize that came along. I came out at the top of the school marks. Part of it was applying to medical school. Send an application. Oh my God, here I am in medical school. I walk into NYU. I thought I walked into a wall.
Wow.
I had no realization of what medical school was really all about. There was no one in my family other than my brother in dental school.
Yeah.
And I really had sincere doubts about it. I used to wander over to the where the city examiner was doing all those postmortems. I kind of got a little interested, and they kind of thought I was bizarre. And then I wasn't certain, but in my third year, Dr. Mulholland was the chairman of the Department of Surgery. Dr. Duboulet was his next in line. Very famous. Mulholland was editor of the Annals of Surgery. Duboulet was major with the common channel theory. And I decided, no surgery for me. These two guys, because they came out of the operating room rough and tough and bloodied up, and I couldn't see this at all.
Oh
so
my.
I think, oh, here we go again. Now I don't know again. But my fourth year.
Are you meaning to tell me that early in your career, blood made you queasy?
Not queasy, but just the only thing I didn't mind was collecting the chicken blood from.
Because talk about irony.
Right, exactly. It is ironic when I think back. But in my fourth year, when I rotated on surgery at St. Vincent's in New York, and Dr. Rousselot was the chairman. He was world famous for portacaval shunting, and also subsequently became the first head of HEW in Washington. A brilliant man. One day I was assigned to him with a 19-year-old girl who had a fibroadenoma of the breast. And this patient and I were terrified because Dr. Rousselot was coming. But I have to tell you, Dr. Rousselot treated the two of us, the patient and me as the so-called assistant, like his own children. I just like fell in love with him. I realized, oh my God, you can really be a decent human being and be. I changed at that moment and said, I'm going into surgery. Surgery needs people like this.
Does Dr. Rousselot know that he had that kind of impact on you?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And I regret that, by the way. But I ended up interning at Montefiore with the idea of moving on, which I did with surgery. And
now at this point, you were still thinking general surgery?
Oh yeah, there was no such thing as a specialty of vascular.
Yeah.
So in my first year of at Montefiore, Dr. Amivici was the chief of vascular, but what we did were sympathectomies, amputations, and varicose veins. During that first year, my senior brother, who was in the second year, I remember him very well, he was ahead of me at NYU, he was ahead of me in the surgical program, came in one day and said to me, Herb, I just quit, I'm going into psychiatry, and if you know what's good for you, you should get out right now. And I said, Gene, I think surgery needs people like me. I'm staying. Wow. That was I remember that. And I stayed. I really liked it. I was beginning to like it more and more. In my second year, vascular moved up into an occasional embolectomy, which was unbelievable. You have to cut down on the arteries at the foot, at the groin, flush it.
Before the embolectomy catheter.
Before the catheter. It was an awful procedure, and I really didn't care for it. And then I got stuck with Dr. Amivici doing in the constant temperature room, measuring the temperatures before and after sympathectomy. And that's what I learned that if you need to do a unilateral sympathectomy, do it on both sides, because the temperature results are better with the crossovers that you divide. And I got along with Dr. Amivici, but the person who most impressed me during those years was Dr. Elliot Hurwitz, who most people don't know. He was also a pioneer. He really was a pioneer of vascular surgery. He worked with Bob Gross up in Boston, and was very responsible for the first aortic homographs. And of course that didn't work out. But he ultimately came to Montefiore and became the chief there. In fact, I even knew his salary. And I wished that someday I could make that amount of money. His salary as full-time chief in the 60s was $35,000.
Wow.
So it kind of gives you a perspective of how far we've come.
Yeah.
But he was a wonderful human being, and there was a pyramid system at that time, and by the second and third year there were three of us. It was me, Dr. Friedman, and Carl Silver.
How many of you started? How steep of a
well,
pyramid?
there were, I think there were 6 or maybe even 8 of us. And then it dropped down to 4 or 5, and then by the third year, the 3, and then by the last year, 2 only.
Wow.
So by the PGY4 level, before chief residency, there were 3 of us, and we knew one of us was going. We weren't certain. And then just before the 5th year started, Dr. Hurwitz called the 3 of us in and said, I've had a lot of trouble, which one of you goes? So I decided, since we're affiliating with the city hospital, Morris Senior City Hospital, I'm keeping all 3 of you.
Oh, wow.
That was wonderful. And that was an amazing thing. Carl, ultimately, who wanted to go into cardiac surgery, and he did a wise move, and we are still friends too. He became the chief of head and neck surgery at Montefiore after Max Somm. Carl is retired now, but excellent head and neck surgeon. The other, Friedman, Richard went down to general practitioner. I had all my plans to go back to Long Branch, New Jersey. But during my residency, that was Vietnam War was beginning. And they were drafting out of the program. And at that point in time, there was a program from Washington called the Berry Plan. My older brother was conscripted actually into the Air Force, and they were going to pull him out of his oral surgical training, and they had him scheduled to go to Anchorage, and he said, but I'm training, and they let him go. So then the following year they were going to send him to Reykjavik in Iceland. And he said, but I'm still training, and they let him go. In the 3rd year they sent him to Madrid, and he had the best time of his life. So I figured, I'm going to join the Air Force. And I signed up with the Berry program, and I got it, which was great, which meant that they allowed me to finish my training, and I had to guarantee them after that I would go in for 2 years as a surgeon, which would be okay, wherever I go. But by 1965, just when I was finishing my residency and going to the service, Vietnam was heating up. That was the Gulf of Tonkin at that point, and President Kennedy had been assassinated, and I can tell you something about that. And then Johnson was there, and the question was, where am I going to end up going?
Yeah.
And they have the free dinners late at night when you're a resident, and you come down at 9 and 10 and eat something. So I did that often. I was married at that time, 2nd year, and
we're going to get back to that in a minute.
Okay. But I was sitting there one evening, and Dr. Schwedel, a cardiologist, sits down with me and says, hey, Herb, what are you doing? And I told him. He says, I have a good friend of mine who's down at Andrews Air Force Base, and he's the commander. He's a cardiologist. His name is Archie Hoffman. Why don't you drop him a note and tell him I said so? And I did. I didn't hear anything for 2 or 3 months. Now, by this time, Janet is pregnant with Alan. And I get a message in January of the year of 65. And I'm finishing in June. Dr. Dardik, and he apologizes to me as general. Sorry, I was away on TDY, which is some assignment, but if you want to come down, I did. So I traveled down there to Washington. I walk into his office, and here's a Damon Runyon character sitting back there with his feet up on the desk, puffing a cigar. All right, Dardik, and this and that. And he signs me up to Colonel Cox, who is the chairman, and Latimer Booth, the vice chairman of the department. This is Malcolm Grow Hospital on Andrews Air Force Base. So I get the tour all day. I'm wandering around, see everything. It looks fun, nice. I get down back to Archie Hoffman's office. He pops me down and he says, okay, Dardik, I hear good things about you. You know what? I can send you anywhere in the world where you want to go. You want to go to Paris? You want to go to Budapest? You name it, and you got it. At that point, my brain was operating very well. And I said, sir, I like what I see here, and it's commensurate with my training, and I'd love to be here. And he went like this, boop, you got it.
Wow.
Just like that.
Wow.
And because that was really a wonderful assignment to get. Plus, since I was board eligible, I didn't have to go for basic training. I had that ROTC, but I didn't have to go. So I go back home, and just before I finish, I got my orders, show up at Andrews Air Force Base in August. I had July off. Alan was born in March. And I got myself a 1-month job at Morris Senior City Hospital as an attending. And I'm walking down one day, I figure I'm a big shot, I'm going to get my first case in practice, not private practice. And the chief of radiology calls me over and says, Herb, my son needs a procedure. What is it? He's got this thing in his finger. And I went, oh, he's got a paronychia. I never seen or done a paronychia in all the years of my training. So I ran to the library, looked up how to do it, and I did it. That was my first case.
Oh, that's lovely. Now, you said you were going to tell me something about Kennedy. I'm curious.
Oh, it's just that, we all remember where we were at certain times, like during the World Trade disaster. That day, I was a junior resident with scrubbing on a fen pop with Dr. Amavici. Wow. And Edith Kepish was the anesthesiologist, and she did not say anything because she wanted that case to go. Amavici was not one of the best of the technical surgeons, and he would drag forever, and he never went below the knee. It was all fen pop above the knee, and that's why so many of them failed, because he pushed the fen pop above the knee when he should have been below. But I didn't know it at that time until we finally got moving more advanced. Every year in my training, I was the chief resident because we moved along as things got more and more. But I was in the room, and then just at 4 o'clock, I think it was, she said, oh, I hate to tell you this, and then Amavici left, and I closed up. But I just remember that day with Dr. Amavici. And I just want to step back to, in those days, when a patient came in with an aneurysm, I knew 95% of the time that patient would be dead within 2 weeks. I mean, that was really the way it was.
A ruptured aneurysm or
regular
elective?
Aneurysm, elective. They were difficult to diagnose. You did it on a plain film with calcification, or if it was skinny, you felt it. No CAT scans, no nothing. Even angios didn't really help us much. And it was a very crude way of doing it. The early operations we did, I actually liked. We actually excised the aneurysm. And if you did it well, it was beautiful. But then DeBakey came along with his other way of Crawford and the others, so we switched. But the patients they all had MIs, everything. Even, cardiac care was nothing then. And if you came in for a carotid, forget it. By the way, Dr. Herbert was the first one in the world to do a carotid. It didn't work, and that's why no one realizes it. But there have been some papers written about him. But he did the patient who had a stroke, and that was the mistake. No one knew it. Leg cases came by, and forget it. It was just, they were all closed. I would call Dr. Amavici. He would scream at me, you don't know, I will see you in the morning. In the morning we came in, did a thrombectomy. I called him back that night. Dr. Amavici closed again. You don't know. And then it ultimately ended up with an amp. When I finished my training and went to the Air Force, I told my wife, we're going to Long Branch. I'm going to practice at home, general surgery, and I am not doing vascular surgery. And it's the fact, and Janet will even tell you that.
So that's a perfect segue into Janet. I would like to hear, how did you meet Janet?
Interesting story. I was kind of a studious kid and really didn't date at all. I think I just dated 1 or 2 girls somewhere along the way. But that was never in my mind, anything serious. One of the things my father did was teach us how to conduct the services on the High Holy Days for Rosh Hashanah. I didn't have a great voice. My brother did, and he got better jobs. But what we did was, people would come down to the Jersey Shore, and if the holidays were early, they would stay there. They didn't want to get involved with the actual services at the synagogue because, first of all, they weren't members, and secondly, the services were forever, for long. They wanted to just come in, do their thing, and go. So I learned how to do it. I learned everything about it, and I would arrive at this hotel, Vendome Plaza. It was about 3 or 4 miles away. It was a walk. 9 a.m., and I finished at 12 on the button. And in the earlier days, some grandmas would come running up to me and, oh, I want you to meet. I just took off. I couldn't take that. So I went back to where my father was and joined up in the synagogue until like 3 in the afternoon. I had just finished college in 1956, And I was doing it there. And in those days, by the way, I got paid for just that little job. I would get paid $250 for that.
Good.
That was a good part of my major living costs for college.
Yeah.
So between the scholarship
It's a
and
lot
that,
then.
I did all right. So I was there and I was doing the service, and I looked up, and in walks a young lady with a black dress and a scallop white top part. I remember it. I said, ooh, I'm going to hang around. And I did, and I was kind of hoping that the right grandma would come by. I wasn't sure. And the right grandma came by, who knew my parents, and introduced me to her, and we just went out and had a little walk on the boardwalk and sat down. And I had mixed reaction. And I was very courteous. I took her number, and I said, oh, we'll call you, and I'm starting medical school. The fact of the matter is, I kind of thought she was a little too fancy for me. She had this ring on that I remember her father gave her. It's not my style. I went off to medical school.
Oh,
Totally
my.
forgot about her.
Oh, my.
Totally forgot about her. She was out of my head. I was consumed with medical school. That next summer was the last summer I had off. And it was between the first and second year. And that was the last that I worked. During summers, I used to work in Asbury Park. I worked at a place called the Fun House, Ferris wheel, merry-go-round, shooting galleries, all that. The people who worked there, their brain power was somewhat limited. So if John from the merry-go-round ran the Ferris wheel, he screwed it up. He really would mess it up, and you have to distribute the weight. And the same thing with all the other rides. So I became the relief person. Whoever was off, I took their spot. That was my job. I used to earn about $800 a summer, which was very good.
That's a lot of money.
So that's how I covered all my costs.
So your wife.
So that was my job, and in the mornings, I would run down to the beach. And there was one beach in Deal, New Jersey, which was about 5 miles away, that was run by my old civics teacher, and he always let me in for free. So I went down there one day in the morning, in the weekend, and I snuck in next door to the Deal Casino. That was the fancier place. And Janet's parents always came down in the summertime, and her father would commute back and forth. He was a lawyer. So I walk into this thing, and I walk up to the pool. Oh my goodness, there's that girl from last year. And I walked over and I said, hi, do you remember me? And she looked up from the pool and says, oh yes, you're the rabbi. And at that point, I found her a little bit more enticing, and I started calling her. But I only had time in the morning. I really didn't have money to spend on dates. I needed it for school. Her mother told me that I was the only one that she would answer the phone for. So I would pick her up in the morning, 10 o'clock, we'd go for a ride, we'd have discussions, talk or whatever. By the end of the summer, she had my college sweater, she had my Phi-Beta key, and I went back to school. I started calling her. I used to go out to Jersey City, borrow the parents' car, go down to Douglas, which was in New Brunswick, where she was. And by Christmas time, I gave her an engagement ring.
Aww.
It was so fast. And then by the following June, we got married.
What year was that?
1958. So I met her first in 56. I re-met her in 57. By the end of 57, we were engaged. And by middle of 58, we were married.
So you've now been married for how long?
Almost 54 years now.
Congratulations.
54 years. And then Alan was, the firstborn was 7 years later. Because
Okay.
after we got married, I had medical school. She had to still finish college.
Yeah, tell me about, you have 3 children. So Alan is your firstborn.
Alan is the firstborn, born when I was chief resident. And by that time, we had already been married 7 years. And I must say, when I first saw him the day he was born, I was kind of shocked at myself because I had no emotional reaction to this kid who didn't particularly look great because he was all squashed looking and whatever. And I went back home and said, I don't know, there's something wrong with me. And, but I have to say, as the weeks and months went by, you get pulled in.
Does Alan know that part
I'm
of the
sure.
story?
I I've told him a million times. But the thing is, you do develop, and I think fathers, it takes longer for a father, if I'm an example, to become emotionally attached to your child. The mother, it's instantaneous. Because you bear that child, you have that child. I mean, the father's sitting around maybe feeling sorry for the wife. You know, in those days, fathers were not allowed in the obstetrics area, so I never saw him born. But I did get attached. It was amazing. And this is my son. And so that's what happened. So he spent the first 2 years of his life, after a few months in New York, at Andrews Air Force Base. And then, I have so many stories from Andrews too.
Well, tell me about your other two children.
Michael was born after I had returned to New York and was working at Montefiore. He was born in 1969. And then 2 years later, just when I dropped out of full-time at Montefiore and I went into private practice, Sharon was born. We had 2 boys, clearly, and Janet was kind of done. But I wanted a girl. So I made up a document, very official looking, that be it known and the powers, etc. I had it notarized, signatured by me. That was it. I handed it to Janet. She must have fallen for it because 10 months later we had a girl.
But what did this document say?
Oh, we guaranteed the birth of a girl.
Oh, very nice. Now, for those who may not know, although I'm sure most people do, tell me about what Alan does for a living.
Alan is a vascular surgeon. And I have to say, all 3 of my children are doctors, but I never expected any of them to go into medicine. That goes for Alan, too. Because during his high school years, I have to point this out, there's a holiday, Hanukkah, where we give the children gifts every day. And it's kind of a little gift. And one year I decided, this is ridiculous. And he was around 14 years old, I think, at the time. And I decided, I got to get him something good. So I had a young protege who is a vascular surgeon in Des Moines, Iowa right now, who was working with me. I said, Alan, what should I do? I said, go to Radio Shack. They have these Model 1 computers. This is before IBM and Apples and all that. Okay. So I go and pick up this thing, and I give it to him. Well, I never saw Alan for the next few months, except he surfaced from the bedrooms are downstairs, and he would come up and he said, Dad, look what I did. And then he shows me some little article he wrote. And then I'm getting to see this kid knows something about computering. I said, Alan, I got this data on my umbilical veins. And I used to sit up at night calculating out standard errors and the patency rates. It was, square rooting out to 10. It was horrible time expenditure. I said, here's 10 patients. I gave him the thing. Can you write something, whatever it was, Pascal and all these languages? He did it. Well, I knew he could do it also because the high school principal told me he had taken Alan into his confidence, and Alan wrote a program for the high school teachers' salaries. So I knew he could do something, and I knew the answers. I said, this is the way you do life patency things. And it took him whatever. He came back. We put it in there. Seconds. Boom. The answer was there.
Pretty nice.
So I said, listen, Alan, I need you. I got 400 cases now, 500, and it's murder. So Alan, a smart little kid, says, can't do it on my computer. You have to buy me a bigger computer. So I did. I go with him to Radio Shack. I spent the whole day there. I ended up, and it was much more expensive in those days, $13,000 I spent. And we got a Model 2, a multi-pen plotter, a hard disk, a few other jimjicks there. We brought it home. He started writing and doing, and I have to tell you, it was one of the best times of my life, because here's my son who knows computers, knows nothing about vascular in high school. Here I am, I don't know about computers, and wrote the program, did it all, and that's what enabled me to start putting out those umbilical papers and all what I was starting to do.
Well, I want to get back to that.
Sure, okay.
Now tell me about Michael. What does he do for a living?
Michael is a pathologist.
Ah.
And I thought Alan was going to be a computer person, ends up in medicine. Michael is really, I think, the brightest one of us all. He's the kid that gets 800s in those SATs and all. And I was convinced he was going to be an astronomer, a mathematician, a physicist. And he goes up to Harvard and decides he's going to medicine. And he ended up with Alan at the University of Pennsylvania. And one day he calls me up and says, Dad, I think I'm going to go into surgery. And after I hung up, I said to Janet, this is not good. This kid has never, ever lifted an instrument, a fork, a hammer. I always made model airplanes, and Alan did, and Sharon did. He was not interested in it. So I said, how could this kid do this? I don't know how to tell him. Next day, Michael calls back and says, Dad, I changed my mind. I'm going into pathology. I said, Michael, great idea. I had spent a year of my career also in pathology, and I loved it. And if I were not a surgeon, I would have become a pathologist.
Interesting.
And Michael did it, and it was the right fit. And he is currently in charge of surgical pathology and runs the whole residency program at St. Barnabas in New Jersey, which is the largest hospital in New Jersey. And he's really terrific. He's a great
now tell me about
pathologist.
Sharon.
Sharon is my normal kid. She had to work hard in school. She had to go through exams a few times. And I was convinced she was going to become either the ballet star or a linguist. She was very good with languages, fluent in multiple languages, including Japanese. And I took her once to Japan, and she really saved the day for me out there. In college, she went to Barnard, and didn't really, I wasn't certain, but then she ended up and decided to go and she got her MPH, her Master of Public Health at Columbia. And then at that point, she decided, she saw all of her friends having trouble getting positions and jobs. She said, you know, I'm going to go to medical school. She ended up in medical school, and she ended up as a pediatrician. She married one of, he's younger than she is, but he was in St. George Medical School. And she became a pediatrician, and he is now an anesthesiologist and has his boards also in pediatrics from Columbia, Robert Wood Johnson and all that, and they are at Morristown Hospital in New
Wonderful.
Jersey.
Okay, so now let's get back to you and your
Okay.
career. So we left off after your general surgery training. You did 2 years with the Air Force.
Correct.
And now when you're done with that, it's time to go back to your job. So tell me about your first job after the Air Force.
I was all slated to go back to practice in Long Branch, and I actually had an office picked out, and I was picking out the colors. And my brother called me saying that he had been offered. Dr. Herwood passed away.
Your brother, Irving.
Irving. Dr. Herwood passed away in 1966. He was replaced by Dr. Marvin Gleedman, who came from downstate, and he was an authority on pancreatitis and was working on pancreatic transplantation. He brought with him Scott Bowley of intestinal angina fame, ischemic colitis, a few others, and of course he brought Frank Veith with him. I knew that both Frank Veith and Marv Gleedman were Markle scholars at the time, and that to me, I was very impressed. Marvin Gleedman liked my brother, who was his chief resident, and offered him a position, but Irving would not do that unless Herbert was involved. So that's how I was invited to come up, and I met Dr. Gleedman, and he offered us both the position, and my job and Irving's was to be basically to run the surgical program of Montefiore at Marsania City Hospital. And so I did that. And my starting salary, I remember, was something like $17,000 or $18,000.
Wow.
Pretty good.
Now this was considered an academic practice.
Yes, I was hospital-based full-time, and whatever I could make on my own, if I could build up, fine. If I couldn't, oh, too bad, and you're on your own. So my job was the surgery at Marsania, which was really great. And we would do, Irving and myself, and a few other helpers for night call, about 30, 35 cases a week. And on weekends, it was busy as all heck with trauma, knife
Well, that's
and
very
guns
busy.
and the like, very, very busy.
Between the two of you, 35 cases a week.
Some of it was also night cases done by others from Montefiore who shared the night call with us. So there were about 4 or 5 others, but they were part-time. And there was one other full-timer, but he was not that great.
But you didn't stay with this job for very long.
Well, I was
so what
there
happened?
for about 4 or 5 years, and that begins the complexity of it. My brother actually dropped out and joined another person in private practice in '69. I stayed on because I had been led to believe that I would be the next chief of vascular after Heimavici would retire.
At Montefiore.
Right, and at that time, Frank Vieth actually was not a vascular surgeon. He was actually focused on lung transplantation. And but Frank, I think, had his eyes on becoming chief of transplant, but Dr. Gliedman, who held that position as well, didn't want to give that up. And I was younger and expendable, so, and I must say, Frank would come around. We had a very good relationship. I wrote these papers, I stuck his name on, and he would watch some of the things, and he picked that up. And so in '71, when Heimavici retired, Frank was appointed chief of vascular. Now, of course, he's really a brilliant fellow and has done well. But for me, that was, whoa, wait a minute, this is not what I had signed up for.
You were promised that job, right?
Kind of, if you want to call it a promise or however it was, but that's what I was led to believe. And I was disappointed, and after a few months I decided, and my brother, of course, convinced me to go and join him. And I remember marching into Dr. Gliedman's office, telling him I'm leaving, and he looked at me and he said to me, you're making a huge mistake. And I said, I know I'd like this. You wait and see. That was it. I walked out. Many, many years later, Gliedman died, but I met him at a meeting, and he pulled me over, and it was the only time, and I think about it very often, he said, Herb, I made a mistake with you. I should never let you go. That was really very, but what happened, I joined my brother, and Sharon was born at that time.
Where'd you join him? Where's your practice?
In the Bronx, at Montefiore. But then, suddenly, I found myself...
So you were still at Montefiore, the same
still at
hospital,
Montefiore, right.
but just private practice.
Right. The other surgeon was at Montefiore, but had most of his practice outside, Parchester, Lebanon, Mount Eden, 10 places. And my brother joined them before, and they had a deal, because my brother loved to run, so he would let him off during the day and go running. But my brother was a sap also. He took night call every night for that exchange. So
he took night call so that he could run in the daytime.
So he could run during the day, and it was a weird exchange, but they did. And I joined them, and this is not my thing, so I made a schedule, you know, where we are going to do this and that. And of course, the senior guy doesn't like me already. Here we go, I'm messing things up. But we're very busy. I never did so many operations a day. At Parchester, Tuesday was my day. I'd go in there. There were 3 operating rooms, all for me, no one else. And I went from room to room to room, and I would do a gallbladder, a biopsy, a lot of the little simple things. But in those 13, 14 cases were a couple majors. But we moved it and I'd finish the case and I would dictate it, do my usual gallbladder dictation. Boom, into the next room, ready to go. Turn over 3 rooms. I was done by 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. I hated it. There was no interaction. The medical doctors really assumed the control there for whatever it was. I mean, I came and made rounds, or whoever one of us did, but I didn't enjoy myself.
So what'd you do?
Well, one day, the senior person and his wife, who was an anesthesiologist, went off, believe it or not, to Afghanistan in those days. It was safer. And they, as part of the WHO, they volunteered for that. So I was 2 weeks in the office, and I was sitting there one day, and in marches a medical doctor and says to me, Herb, got that envelope? I don't know, what are you talking about? He said, just open the drawer. I see the envelope and I could feel there's paper money in there.
Oh.
Yeah. So I said, is this it? He says, yeah, that's it. And I realized, oh my goodness, now I know why we're so busy. Because it was a practice that it was unethical from the American College of Standards, College of Surgeons standards. You don't split fees. So this was a practice that was built up on that, and I recognized it. So I told him, I said, Irving, I'm getting out of here. And before Harold got back, I already found myself an office down on Park Avenue, not far from Ida Vinci's, right across the street from Lenox Hill. And I said, you got to decide what you want to do. Harold came back, I marched in, and I told him, I never told him the reason. I said to him, I do vascular, you don't. I want to do my own. And I left, and he was happy to see me go.
Wow.
10 minutes later, my brother walks in there and tells him the same thing. The senior person, he never forgave us for me for what I had done. But Irving and I broke away, we started our practice, and we exploded with business and we went back to Montefiore purely.
The Dardik brothers.
And people who knew this was going on were suspicious about me and Irving. Why would we have gone? But then we didn't know that. But when we broke away, oh my God, we ended up having the largest practice in general surgery and vascular surgery at Montefiore.
Wow.
I was doing stomachs and colons and gallbladders and fempops and aneurysms and not too many carotids, because Montefiore, the carotid life there was suppressed because of the old field study, which was based on the lack of knowledge of you don't do it if you had a stroke. Mm-hmm. And so the neurologists became so anti-carotid there that I don't know today, but the carotid volume was poor. I learned that all by myself, how to do it. And in fact, a lot of the stuff I had to learn by myself, getting to the perineal and stuff like that.
Wow.
There was no one around doing this. A few here or there.
Now you're in practice with your brother Irving.
Correct.
So I have to ask you a very important question. One of the things that you are incredibly well known for is basically this discovery and description of the use of the umbilical vein as a conduit.
Fascinating
So
story.
how did that idea even come about?
Okay, we're in practice, and we were working predominantly at Montefiore, and Irving lived in Englewood, in Tenafly, and I lived in Teaneck. 4 o'clock in the morning one night, telephone rings. It's my brother. Tell me, are there any blood vessels and cords? I said, Irving, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing? He says, I'm over here at Montefiore doing a thrombectomy. I said, let's talk about it tomorrow, okay? All right. Tomorrow comes, and you have to know Irving, comes in his head. He's very bright, but then it's gone. So I call, what is all this stuff you're talking about? Well, I was in there last night with the resident. I was doing an AXFEM of a bovine graft that we had done, and I remember the case. And I was doing a thrombectomy, and out comes this stuff, and the thrombus looked just like jelly. So I asked the resident, where's there jelly in the body? The resident didn't know. So I said, you idiot, it's in the umbilical cord, Wharton's gel. So then he says to me, I was thinking about it. Weren't there little blood vessels in there? I said, I think so. So I was still doing some work at Morrisania. And Montefiore did not have an OB department. So I had my secretary collect in huge jars, a bunch of cords, in formalin, took them home, put them in the basement. It was springtime. I forgot all about it. Comes the fall. Janet is down there. That's where she did the ironing. She said, please, get rid of that stuff. I can't stand looking at it. So I throw it out. And then I thought to myself, that's stupid. I collected it. So I go out there on a redwood table in the backyard with Alan and his little dissecting kit. I'm cutting this formalized tissue, which looks awful. And I get in the car and drive over to my brother's house and says, look at this. This is, maybe we can do a patch in the heart with it or something. Why don't we get some fresh cords? We were not on at Englewood yet. So we drove down to Englewood. I don't know how we seduced those nurses to collect it, but we did. They thought we were crazy. They collected cords for us. So we collect these cords, and we're piddling with it. My brother had a big basement, and from Montefiore, one day we took the extracorporeal heart pump from the laboratory. It was this long thing where we carried it out. Guards knew us. They said, go ahead, you need it for the weekend? Sure. So we took it to my brother's house, hooked it up, and hooked up a circuit with I drew blood from my brother.
You took this home, an extracorporeal unit?
Yeah, it was for animals. It was for animals. And we hooked it up and ran the umbilical in the circuit for over the weekend.
What'd you run in this circuit?
His blood, my brother's blood. And it didn't coagulate, so we figured, this has got heparinoids in there. You know what? Why don't we can start a new business. We can do BBBs are of America, belly button banks of America. We'll store the cords, and we'll have it available when the person grows up to be 70 and needs something. There's your own tissue. Use this thing. We were practicing getting it out. Umbilical artery is very difficult to get out, and it's still a challenge. And I'm still doing something with that. But the umbilical vein was much easier. We can dissect it out and do it. So then we went back to Frank and Marvin and said, listen, this is an idea. We want to work on this. Stupid idea. Won't work. And besides, you guys are in private practice, and private practitioners don't do research. So I won't tell you what I said on the way out, but we arranged, my brother and I, we got in contact with the person who was overseeing, he was a immunologist, Dr. Morzemkowski, who's pretty well known. He's part of the NYU blood banking circuit. And up in Sterling Forest, New York, they had a primate laboratory up there called LEMSIP, Laboratory for Experimental Medicine and Surgery in Primates. So we went up and we talked to Dr. Morzemkowski, and he's telling us, it'll take you 3 months. So I knew he was an immunologist. I said, but Dr. Morzemkowski, wouldn't you be interested to know if we take human tissue and put it in a baboon, what the immunology is? Okay, tomorrow you get your baboons.
Oh, that was
Just
good.
like that. But we had to pay for it. It was cheap. It was $300 a baboon. We took our own practice money and we sunk it in. We then went back and forth. We took unmodified human tissue into a baboon, so it was a xenograft. It looked beautiful. We did aortic interpositions. And then 6 weeks later, we started coming back on them. Oh my God. They all turned into aneurysms. They were destroyed. I was so distraught. And I thought, maybe I'll write a paper on the experimental production of aneurysms. That was my thought. But then I went back to thinking, when I was a resident, Norman Rosenberg, who was from New Brunswick, New Jersey, had developed the bovine graft. And he was buddies with Elliot Hurwitz, who was my chief. And I remember hanging around and running during that year of pathology. I also ran to the lab and helped out with the dialdehyde starch and the glutaraldehyde and the processing. So I said to Irving, let's do this. So we got formaldehyde, dialdehyde, glutaraldehyde. In his basement, my brother's basement, we set up all this stuff. We started doing it. And there was no FDA, no one to stop us. I wanted to put one in, and we made these things, and I wanted to put it in a patient in Montefiore. Frank wouldn't let us, or no one. So I also had privileges at a little hospital on Fordham Road called Union Hospital. They were so nice to us. They were so good. So the chief was a good guy, got the administrator, okay, do it. So we did a dozen cases there. In fact, we prepared it all in the basement, brought it over, and we had done we erred in one area. We treated with glutaraldehyde and we stored in glutaraldehyde, which is the way the porcine heart valve was being done. You could do that with a heart valve. It's a high flow circuit, but you can't do it, as we subsequently learned, with a lot of tissue and a lesser flow. And so all the grafts coagulated within 24 hours. I went back on all of them. I remember Minnie Barnett so well, and cleaned out the thrombus. It was loaded. We tested it with glutaraldehyde, but once we cleaned it out, they stayed open. And that was a subject of a paper I wrote in Surgery. There was no JVS in those days. And I put it together, and I really wanted to get it at Montefiore, and there's no way they would let us do it. But the battle really at Montefiore was that Frank came and wanted co-authorship, and I actually denied him the co-authorship.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this. Was this your first attempt at publishing your results of using the umbilical vein?
That was the beginning of it, because actually the first paper we wrote, at the suggestion of Morzemkowski, was he advised us, publish something and bury it someplace so you have the priority. And we published in 1973 an article in Journal of Primatology.
And that was your first
And that
description.
was the first umbilical paper of that.
Now your second paper.
Second paper was also based on the laboratory work that we had done with much more detailed information. And I was going to send it off, but I knew the protocol was to send it through the research committee at Montefiore if I wanted Montefiore's name attached, even though we didn't do the work there.
And they actually didn't want you to do the work there.
That's correct, but I wanted Montefiore on it, so I stuck Montefiore, 'cause that's my home base, that's where I'm a surgeon. So I did that, and it went through Gleben and Veith, and it comes back, can't publish this without our names on this. Ooh, wait a minute. And I went back, I said, you didn't, where was your physical, economic, mental contribution? It wasn't there. What happened, and I didn't really realize it, Frank was reapplying for a major multi-million-dollar lung transplant grant. And he kind of put in there a little bit more exaggeration than what he should have. I am responsible for the work of the Dardiks, and they needed proof. And he didn't have it. And not knowing about this, I wouldn't deliver. So we ran into a big battle at the NIH level, Montefiore level, my level. Legal departments there, but no, I did my own legal. I wrote this whole story up, and they agreed with me, and they kind of slapped Frank's hand, but they gave him the grant. And then when I went back to Montefiore to do my surgery, it was a little more difficult.
So you published your article without their names on it?
We did, and I owe that to, with the help of Dr. Howard Laufman, another major pioneer in American vascular surgery from Chicago. I met him after I came back to Montefiore on a full-time basis. And as an aside, I have to tell you, that was the man most responsible for teaching me how to write. I wrote, he kind of got me introduced to the world of Dexon and other new things. I was writing them. I wrote the things. He made me do 7 revisions. On the 7th revision, he took out his pen and he said, okay, with my fine Italian pen, watch this. And he would start writing right in front of me. I would walk out with the draft. I would say, how can a person do this? This is gorgeous. He took my garbage and made it Shakespeare. And that was the man that kind of made me realize that you can really do something and have a beautiful work of art in a way, in the form of a paper.
But as I understand, you had a hard time publishing that article, and did he, is he the one who picked up the phone and called Loyal Davis?
He was the one, coming from Chicago. He knew Loyal and kind of put in the good words for me and my brother, and Loyal was extraordinarily wonderful and supportive. And in went that paper into, then it was SGNO, Surgery, Gynecology, and Obstetrics. And there were a series of papers. People don't realize that the first aneurysmal biodegradation of the umbilical vein, everyone takes credit for having been the first, but in reality, I was the one that wrote it first in SGNO, and that cost me my relationship with the Menox medical people who were manufacturing it. They were upset that I was also warning everybody that there's a problem.
Interesting.
So it's interesting how
industry, the initial,
right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Now, in addition to the umbilical vein, you're also known for popularizing a couple of other techniques, and in particular, the distal AV fistula.
Right.
How did that come about?
That's actually one of my proudest achievements. I was one of the early people to do distal bypasses, tibials, perineals, and the perineal exposure is another one of my findings, which is a story unto itself. But I was at Englewood and I was doing a fem distal bypass, and it just kept closing on me. It was thrombectomy, it closed 3, 4, 5 times. Right next to the perineal artery was this huge perineal vein. And I was just frustrated, and I figured, all right, I had done a graftotomy over the distal anastomosis to get to the thrombus. So the last time I cleaned it out, and I took the perineal vein and just plunked it on end to side on top of the umbilical vein graft. And I'm sitting there waiting for it to close. It didn't close. I spent an hour. It should have closed 10 times, but it didn't. I thought, oh my God, I discovered something here. And it worked. That was the first case I did. It was oh boy, I have to remember, 1978 or 79. I have to check it. And my partners actually, I did another couple within a few weeks. My partners at that time, even my brother, they didn't believe it. And then shortly thereafter, I became ill and I was out of the practice for a while. And in fact, this particular patient had the other side done by my partners at that time, who didn't do a DAVF, and he lost his leg. And the patient lived for another 4 or 5 years on my side, continued forever with him.
Wow.
But when I came back, I started doing these things and figuring out, and I started doing flow studies, and then eventually we did Doppler studies. And I became convinced that, and the whole theory was so simple, but believe it or not, I had so much difficulty, I still do. Doctors don't understand it, even the vascular people, because they equate it with congenital or acquired or excess fistulas. It's totally different. I don't want to make a lecture out of this, but
Right.
The fact is, when you're taking a lot of blood from the femoral and send it express nonstop down to the bottom of the foot, it's an overload,
Right.
and you have to decompress. And you decompress right into the venous system. Other things happen, which are also fascinating, but that process suddenly upped my patency rates at the tibioperineals 15-20% more at the 2-3 year level.
Do you still do it today?
Absolutely. I'm up to 400. I'm up to almost, I think it's around 400 I've done. I'm going to review it because I want to write another
You need
follow-up.
to.
I consider this an absolute essential of doing distal bypasses for when you have a prosthetic, if you have a poor vein, or if you have whatever you use, poor runoff.
Wow.
And that's what I do.
Now let me ask you about another thing that you
Right.
popularized, the eversion patch for the carotid
yes,
endarterectomy.
Right. I've done a lot of carotids, and in the course of doing this years ago, I used mostly saphenous vein, and the patients usually complain more of that, where we did the leg incision than the neck. And one day, I'm looking to see this giant external jugular. I said, why don't we do that? So what I started doing was I started taking the vein out. And I realized I could turn it inside out like a stocking, flatten it out. We built a little contraption where I could put it in, and then I could blow with a manometer, push air in there, and get it up to 500-600 millimeters of pressure. And it would burst at around 400-500, which is the same as a single layer saphenous. So I was brave one day, and I started putting them into people. And I learned, and it was excellent. I do it episodically for the fellows now, just to show them that in case you ever need a patch or an infected area or something, how to do it. But I've actually switched over because it's still easier to take I like bovine pericardium.
As do I.
Right, but I like it, it's easy, it's faster, simple.
Yeah.
But there's something really still, to me, beautiful, and I almost had to chop my arm off to switch over.
That's
But
funny.
I think it's a good technique to know. Others have reported on using that actually in the femoral or other sites. But the bovine is, but we
It's
have
good.
other good alternatives.
What's the Dardik clamp?
One day I was thinking about the horrible trauma that we were causing with the standard DeBakey's, and they have high pressure. And there were two different ones. One was a clamp that I thought we could design with a curve, because most atherosclerosis is in the posterior part of the artery. So I thought about clamping it down. And we developed that, but that never went anywhere. But one other day I thought to myself, the principle of the Indian on the bed of nails, nothing happens because it's a distribution of weight and over a wide area of the nails. So I thought, why don't we make a broader clamp, and it won't be as powerful, which it is not. And I actually call it a D-clamp, but they put my name on it. And I use it all the time for proximal control of the carotid, and I have stopped seeing cracking and things like that. I use it on the profunda, I'll use it on the SFA. You can't do it on the iliac femoral because it's not that strong. I could clamp my finger and it's not bad. If I clamped it with a DeBakey, I have to run to the ER. So it's an atraumatic clamp for specific locations.
So you've had so many different things that you've been recognized for and that you've really pioneered and described in the literature. You've received numerous awards for your work over the years. But what did it mean for you to receive the Hechtone Gold Medal Award from the American Medical Association?
That was terrific, I must say. I knew at that time, the umbilical vein was really around the world. It was like, wow, it's like environmentally very good. We're salvaging this 9-month-old tissue, and it's terrific. And at that time, exhibits were very different than they are now. They were constructed in huge formats, and the AMA ran a competition, and the winning exhibit was the Hechtone Gold Medal. So I put together an exhibit all about umbilical vein, how you do it, making, and some data. And we won the Hechtone Gold Medal. It's a very nice little medal. It really is. I had to make copies of it in order to give one to my brother, and one to my parents, and one to Dr. Ibrahim, who was our partner. But it was a thrill. It really was.
Wow. Another thing that is interesting about your career that really sets you apart is that you basically have had a lifelong career in private practice, but yet your CV, and this is a rather extensive CV, is one that would appear as if you were in academics. How did you do this?
Work. I owe that to my parents, and especially with all the studying I had done with my father. And I think at heart I'm an academician, and I consider myself an academic clinician. Alan is an academic, and maybe he's a clinical academician, I don't know, but they're the shades of gray. And I made a commitment to myself that I was going to try to publish at least one or more papers per year. I missed 1 year, but...
So let me just stop you right there. You have 167 manuscripts over 47 years, so it's clearly more than one manuscript a year. You have 447 presentations at national and international meetings. You have 48 book chapters, 2 books that you've written, and 7 patents. This is clearly the track record of somebody who appears to be in academia and not in private practice.
Well, I do consider myself partially academic, at least that much. I am a clinician, but I use my clinical work to make me happy as an academic. That's what I really enjoy that. To me, it's not a question of commercial surgery where you do a case, ring it up on your cash register, send the patient off, next. That's not me. And I try to look at things and see if there's something we can do better, change things. And that's the fun I have in it. And part of it is also being efficient. I learned a lot from others. Dr. Laufman is a prime example. How to write, how to do, how to put things together, and it adds up. And I know others who've done twice as much as I have, even, and are also busy clinically.
You're very modest.
Yeah, but I think if I were the emperor of vascular surgery, I would make every surgeon write a paper once a year just to do it, because that's what we did when we were in high school, in college. We had to submit papers, we had to do. And why should we drop it just because we go into practice?
I think that's wonderful advice. A couple more things I want to touch on. You also founded, as I understand, the SCVS.
Actually, not founded it, but what I did do was bring it national. The SCVS was started by Peter Samuels. And at that point, what he did, he thought it was a national organization, but it was really a small collection of Southern Californians. He trapped me one day to come out and do a talk on the umbilical vein, and it was kind of nice. And then once a year, UCLA would sponsor a thing in Palm Springs. It was all California, and a token person here or there. And then I got involved with it, and they asked me to partake, and I said, listen, I'll do it, but you let me run it. And what I actually did was I knew I had to move the meeting out of Palm Springs for a different identity, and I knew I had to get people from around the country. And I went around and I got people, and Dr. De Laurentiis and Larry Oye and all these names, and it started pouring in, and suddenly the organization grew and grew. The economics was out of a shoebox. I got Bill Maloney at that time from PRRI to come in and help, and that was my accomplishment, really, to move it up into a real organization. But the idea for it was really born with Peter Samuels.
So you've had a lot of life experiences over the years. Tell me, what is the greatest challenge that you've faced to date?
I usually tell people the most difficult thing is raising your child. But actually, that's my wife who gets the credit for what we accomplished with the children. For me personally, I had 2 battles with cancer. And in 1980, I was found to have a squamous cell metaplasia of the bladder, which is kind of very rare and really dismal prognosis. I was pretty much written off by most places, Mayo, MGH and the like, experimental chemo. I ended up actually in 1981, I had radical surgery, and I started my new life at that point with an ileostomy and appliance. That kind of got in the way also with because here I was with the umbilical vein and other things. But I was told 2 years might be good enough survival. By 83, my surgeon said, hey, you look like you're a survivor. By 86, 5 years, we had a party and brought champagne into the hospital and gave everyone, we had a great time. A few months later, my cytology turned positive again. So now I've got my second one, and I knew I was probably a done person. But I had become very knowledgeable of bladder cancer and who was whom. And my surgeon actually was getting into the retirement phase. And I knew of a surgeon out in the West Coast who was the only one, by the way, who had experience with continent pouches at that time. And called him up on a Friday. I told him about me. And what sold me with him to go out to the West Coast was the way he told me. He said, you know, I'm sure you're going to have questions about this. Here's my home number. Call me anytime. And that was January of '87, the end of it. By beginning of February, I flew out there, met him. The next morning, I had my surgery, and he found out that I had a new carcinoma transitional cell of the ureter. And that went into my right kidney, into the conduit. So he did a right nephroureterectomy, conduitectomy, and then fashioned me a Coke pouch, which I still have. Wow. 6 years later. Wow. And that to me was world history. And I'm really the urology poster child, having gone through an ileostomy appliance, converted to a continent. I've done well with my single kidney and been busier and busier ever since.
Wow.
I afterwards I do still spend a lot of time with patients in the hospital, usually urologic, but I've even seen women with breast cancer who are so distraught, and I walk in there and I tell them, look at me, look what I did. And it's so gratifying to walk out and see the smiles on their faces.
Yeah.
And that's my other sideline.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Parting advice.
Yes.
What advice would you give to young aspiring surgeons today?
You better love what you do, because if you have any doubts about it, don't do it. And once you love it, you will achieve great, but you have to work. You have to be honest. You can't do something, a procedure, and then magnify it. You walk out of that operating room, you've got to think about, what could I have done better? And if you think there was nothing that you could have done better, something's wrong. because there's always something you can do better. And that's advice I give all my fellows, by the way. Every case, we review it. And also, try to be an academician, too. Collect your data, watch what you're doing, and you'll get better. And maybe you'll discover in that data something you can write about, and you can see your name in lights on Broadway. It's the greatest thrill in the world.
Dr. Dardik, thank you
Good.
very much.
Thank
you
you
so much for this interview.
Thank you very much. I thank you for the interview.